Hi everyone, thanks to SADPC for having me. As Rachel said, I'm a journalist. I started as a blogger when we were working on the Yong Vui Kong case. I wasn't working professionally as a journalist yet, but then I moved into that later. So a lot of my early work on the death penalty issue was really telling stories and working with the family to tell stories. So for example, in the Yong Vui Kong case, another volunteer and I flew to Sabah to see his hometown, to see where he grew up on a plantation, his grandfather's plantation, and we learned a lot about, how various communities are actually more vulnerable to particular crimes and then more vulnerable to being caught and sentenced to death. Because it was you don't really see it in the video that you saw just now, but actually the family, like Chun Ning's family, is also quite divided. So you see the father crying and the siblings comforting him. They don't usually speak, because the father left the family when all the siblings were very young. And so they really don't actually, like when we went to Sabah, they don't meet together, they don't speak. We had to meet them separately. But they came together because of Vui Kong. And what we learned there was that, there's so much hardship and difficulty that kind of led Vui Kong onto this path. So when I was at the plantation with his older sister, brought us to the plantation, and midway through, when we were just walking around the grounds, she would be saying things like, "Oh, that's the pond where our mother, who was suffering from clinical depression, she would make a shower in there at midnight and it's very cold, and if we didn't go in, she would beat us." Or, this is where my grandfather would beat my mother, and then we all watched. And then there was like this cycle of violence, and she said all of us got out of there as soon as we could. And she said, I always kind of regret that I got out of there the moment I was like 16, 17. I just left and I never came back. But Vui Kong was a baby then, and I never came back for him. And she said, if I came back, would he have ended up with gangs? Would he have ended up all the way to, becoming a drug mule and being sentenced to death? So we learned a lot about, what happens behind the crime. So everyone says, oh, they're criminals. This is the law. You break the crime, and so you have to pay the price. But we learned a lot from that experience of, if you wanted to address this crime, there are other things that you could do, like prevention rather than just retribution all the time. So that was one thing that really struck me, working with the families to tell their stories in this way. But because I work on the campaign, I also work with families in a different capacity to help with the campaign, to help with, basically, as Rachel said, to walk with them through this process. So that usually involves things like, from anywhere from fundraising to cover the costs. So for example, the most recent case with Ko Jabing, his family could not afford to come to Singapore. So they would only see him, before we stepped in to fundraise, they would only see him like once every 2 or 3 years, because it would take that long to save the money to buy the plane ticket to come back again. So we will fundraise to cover their costs. Then there's logistics like, booking the flights, booking the hotels, making sure that there's transport, who will pick them up at the airport, how will they get to prison? Does someone have to drive them to prison, or do we need to give them taxi money, or can we just buy them the EasyLink card and show them how to take the bus and things like that? Then there's also things like support. So we try to ask around with friends and networks, if people know of counselors, like grief counselors. If they need help, if they want someone to speak to, then we can say there's this person who is ready to speak to you. We've actually not had the experience where a family member said that they wanted to speak to a counselor, but it's always on our minds to try to put that as an option, so that they know that there is support and all they have to do is ask. What we have found, though, is that usually instead of counselors, what they ask for is to speak to other family members of other inmates. So for Jabing's family, his mother, we offered her a counselor, and she said, I don't want a counselor, but I want to speak to Ina. And Ina is the sister of Roslan, who is also on death row, and in fact was like neighbor. They're not cellmates, but like neighbors. So he was in the next cell to Jabing. And so Jabing's mom said, I want to speak to Ina. I don't want to speak to a counselor, because Ina knows what is going on. And so then, we have seen through this as well that there's actually quite a strong network of support within the families themselves. So like I just called Ina and I said, Jabing's mom is asking for you, and she showed up like 2 hours later. Then we all went for dinner so that she could be there. Then there's also things like, talking through the process, like, okay, this is a court hearing, this is what happens after a court hearing, you wait for this long for the judgment, then this happens, that happens, these are the options. So we talk them through this process because, even for us, I'm not legally trained, so it can be quite confusing. So what more coming from, a longhouse in Sarawak is very confusing. All the legalese, they go to court and they sit in the courtroom, and it's really confusing because there's a lot of technical language. None of it really applies to what they feel should be happening. So for Jabing's case, he was on, I don't know if everyone's already familiar with Jabing's case. Just to summarize quickly, he was convicted of murder and then sentenced to death. Then they amended the mandatory death penalty law, so he was sentenced to life. Then the prosecution appealed, and he was sentenced to death again. So as far as his family was concerned, all these legalese about, they amended the law, should this be the threshold, should that be the threshold, they don't really care. They were just like, what is this? Death and then life and then death again, as if my brother's life is just this game that lawyers play to see who can win, who can get the sentence that they want. And Jumai was very upset about that when we first met her, because she said they're just ping-ponging him around like it's a game, like it's bureaucracy, but it's my brother's life. And so she was very frustrated about that. So then you have to kind of take her through the process and say that, unfortunately, this is what has happened and these are the options. And then we also do things like, basically we take care of the logistics of the general campaign. So things like organizing forums, organizing press conferences, fielding media requests, we do all that so that they aren't inundated with all these things. And also because when the families come to Singapore, they're not familiar with how things work. So like venues, how to get venues to have a press conference or a forum. So we do that for them. But even though we do all that work, I think what was really important that we all were on the same page when we started is that it really is, in many ways, their campaign. So nothing happens without the family's consent. Because, even though we might think, if you do this, it's really good for the publicity, then you can get more awareness. But if they're not comfortable with it, then that's not happening. Because we are doing it as campaigners, and yes, we are committed, but we don't have to live with it every single day. And we don't have to live with the result of the case as well. I mean, we do in a way, but not in the immediate way that the family does. So it's really about making sure that they are comfortable and they actually make the decisions in the campaign. So coming from this, then that led me to what I think was the most important lesson of working with families, because many of the inmates that we meet, they come from very underprivileged, underserved backgrounds. Like they might be from rural villages, like with Wikong, it was from a rural plantation in Sabah. With Jabing, it was from a longhouse in Sarawak. Very rural, low income, poor families, didn't have much chance for education. So Jabing's sister left school at primary 4, and she never went back to school after that. So they might not speak English. They might come to Singapore and just get lost in the whole process because, coming from a very rural environment to Singapore, it's a big city, everyone's speaking English, everyone's speaking illegally that they don't understand. And so with all this, it becomes very easy for us to then see them as like, you're helpless. Let me do it for you. It's very easy for us to mistake the privilege that we have as some sort of superiority, as like, you don't know, I know, so you just sit there and be nice, and I do for you everything. And that's very dangerous because, as Rachel said, that means you're feeling pity instead of solidarity. And you really don't want to be in a situation where you're feeling sorry for them as if they have no agency or no kind of ability to do anything for themselves, because that really colors the way that you act around them, the way that the campaign runs, and the way that they feel about the campaign as well, because it's already very disempowering to come to Singapore and know that your family member is on death row and that the odds are stacked against you. So the last thing you need is for the campaigners to come in and disempower you further by suggesting that you don't know what you're doing and we have to do it for you. So what I saw as my role, particularly in this Jabing case, which I worked on from the end of last year all the way until when he was executed in May, is that I'm really just here to support and facilitate and to make things happen so that Jabing's sister, Jumai, who was really spearheading the campaign, could say what she wanted to say and could reach the people that she wanted to reach. So, I think with Jumai, it was especially powerful to see her because the first time I met her, she really didn't know what was happening. She could barely speak English. We were at the KFC and we could only speak via Google Translate. So like I'll type and then it'll translate to Malay and then she'll type. And it always, Google Translate doesn't work well that way. So always very garbled messages that we are communicating with. And she just really didn't know what to do. She had to take care of her mum and then her children back home, and then there was all this stuff with her brother. People were asking her about clemency letters and all these things, and she doesn't know like what to do. But as we went on, and she became used to being in Singapore and working with us, then you could really see that her inner strength was coming out to fight this. And she has been fighting it far longer than any of us because she was there from the day the family got the call that said Jabing has been arrested. And so one example that I will never forget was we were sitting in the backpackers where they were staying, and this news article came out from Sarawak. So it was the Sarawak media reporting that one of the senior ministers said, there are too many Sarawakians getting in trouble around the world and they commit crimes, so let Jabing be a lesson to Sarawakians to not break the law in other people's countries. And he was essentially saying that the Sarawak government would not help in this case, which was what Jumai was pushing for her own government to speak. And at first there was this whole do we tell Jumai? But then it's no, you can't not tell Jumai that this headline is coming out, especially if the reporter's calling for the family's comment. So I showed Jumai and she just read it and she said, you help me. And then she said, can you help me log into Facebook? And so I did. And she just sat at Facebook and furiously typing away. And about an hour and a half later, she said, I have the phone number of the opposition MP in Sarawak, and if the chief minister will not do it, the opposition will slam him for it. And she just got this through friends. She just went on Facebook and called all her friends. She was literally on the warpath, and people were calling and saying Jumai must feel terrible. I'm she's not. She's really angry and she's doing really well right now. So just let her. And she actually did get the opposition MP. She did speak to him. She did meet him. All the way to the point where we went to KL and we went into Parliament and she met him and she met the Law Minister of Malaysia and said, you are also from Sarawak, so what are you going to do about it? And then there was this about turn of, we wrote a letter to the Singapore High Commission, we will do all we can. It's very sad. We cannot let one of the sons of Sarawak. It was this complete about turn, and it really wouldn't have happened if Jumai herself hadn't been so strongly pushing for it, because we can say it as campaigners, but then they'll just say, those are Singaporean activists, they're just making noise. But it's a lot harder to deny when the sister herself comes up to you and says, I'm very disappointed, I'm a citizen of your country, and you have forsaken my brother, so what are you going to do about it? So I think Jumai really managed to turn it around, and I think that's really important, because if we empower her, she can do these things without us doing it. And it's important that she does it, because then it makes her feel as well that she fought as hard as she could. So for Jumai, we had press conferences in KL. We had the Parliament roundtable that she went to, and she spoke to all these parliamentarians, not just from Malaysia, but also parliamentarians from Australia, and there was someone from the House of Lords in the UK, and she just sat down and she spoke to all of them. And just an hour before that, she was saying, I've never been to KL before, we've only seen Parliament on TV, and now we're inside the Parliament, so what do I do? And but once she's there, she knows what she wants to say. So again, I think it's also important that we don't kind of condescend and think that we need to coach them through press conferences and things. I've really seen that all you need to do is help them get the platform. And Jumai was amazing, and the most powerful things she said were always things that came from her heart, without preparation, because she knows better than anybody what the family is going through and what the family wants and what Jabing wants, because none of us get to go in to see Jabing, but she sees him every day when she's in Singapore. So she was able to bring what he wanted to say out. And I remember we had a press conference here in Agora, and she said, people in prison are lonely, and they can't do anything because they're locked up, but people on the outside can do a lot. And so that's really how she saw herself, that she was helping her brother bring what he wanted to say out to people in the hopes that it would give him a second chance. So I think that's, again, that's just so important, that it's about empowerment, so that, it helps them feel that they are doing the best that they can. So Juma is saying, even though we failed in the end, and we did, and Jabing was executed very suddenly, despite the best efforts of everybody who was involved in the campaign, a lot of late nights, a lot of desperate knocking on doors, and giving interviews to any press who were here so that we could get Jabing's story out. But Jumai said, at least we know, and I know, that I have done absolutely everything that I could think of, and that I was given a chance to do everything I could think of. And what was amazing to us was that hours after her brother was executed, she was waiting to collect the body to go back to Sarawak. And even though everyone was really upset, what she said was, this process has made me think that there are a lot of people who need help, who don't know what to do, so I want to go back to Sarawak and be a human rights activist there. And this was hours after having lost her brother, but because she felt that she's really tried as much as she could, and she felt that there were other people who needed this sort of support as well to empower them, she decided that she wanted to look into whether she could set up her own human rights organization in Sarawak, and she's helping us with another death row case, also from the same town. So she's helping us go between that family, because they're also in Miri and unable to come to Singapore all the time. So that's really the major point that I wanted to make, and I think I'll just leave the time for questions.